No other indoors. All right, you ready, Don Allen?
Yeah.
All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Somerville Church of Christ. My name is Zach Daly. Glad you can make it here this morning, this Easter morning. I hope the Easter Bunny was kind to you last night. He came and visited the kids, but he missed my room. So, no chocolate bunnies for me, unfortunately. But hopefully he fared better than I did.
I guess just a little bit of thing, I don't know how many people understand. I went to it yesterday evening and saw it. It's that new King of Kings show, the animated. It wasn't bad. Of course, they still have the Magi in with the manger. People always do that. But I did note, and it was interesting in the way it was like, the guy who did Christmas Carol, Roger Clements, he was actually the narrator about him telling his kid about that. And when they did that, they combined a few things, some of the miracles, if you really look at it, you can see how they combined them.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that, Norman.
But one thing I noticed that they got right
Yeah.
is where the nails went in. Not here, like most people think, but here. Because that's actually how they did it in that time. Because this was more solid. Nails going in here would just tear out.
All right. Well, thank you for that. So this morning, we are getting close to the end of our study on Elijah. We have this week, and then next week, Don Allen's going to kind of give us a concluding class going over some of the themes that we've seen through Elijah. Today, though, we're going to witness the end of Elijah's ministry and his passing of the torch onto Elisha. You know, we were introduced to Elijah back in 1 Kings chapter 17 in dramatic fashion, right? We had Elijah, a mystery man, no family, no ancestry, just appeared and speaking to the most powerful man in Israel, Ahab, telling him that he was sinning and that there was going to be a drought because of the idol worship that he had encouraged in Israel. We journeyed with Elijah. Sorry, my PowerPoint's messing up. We journeyed with Elijah to the wilderness, where, there we go. We journeyed with Elijah to the wilderness, where he was fed by ravens at a brook, right? And then we went with him while he saved a widow and her son from starvation, where he got a little bit of the family that we were never told that he had. We also saw him perform the first raising of the dead miracle. When that widow's son died of an illness, Elijah prayed to God and that widow's son was raised. We stood with Elijah on top of Mount Carmel when the God of Israel showed the impotence of Baal and Asherah, when fire fell from the sky and consumed the altar that had been drenched with water. And we saw Israel turn back to God, but then we saw Elijah flee from the wrath of Jezebel, right? We saw him journey out back into the desert, no man's land, where he asked God to take his life. We sat with him in the cave on Mount Sinai, the same cave, some believe, that Moses was hidden in when God passed by. We sat with Elijah in that cave as he succumbed to hopelessness and despair. We saw God work and show his power to Elijah through the wind, through the earthquake. We felt the heat of the fire. But God wasn't in any of those powerful displays of nature, was he? He was in the quiet voice that came to Elijah after all of that. We walked with Elijah when he went to confront King Ahab for murdering Naboth and taking his vineyard. And now we have reached the conclusion of Elijah's ministry. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 2. So if you'll flip over to that with me, please. Second Kings chapter 2. We'll start in verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. So right off the bat, we have a bit of a spoiler here, right? The very first verse, we're told that Elijah is leaving. And he's not leaving in the normal fashion, is he? We're told in the first verse that he's going to be taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. We'll see as the story progresses. And isn't that just like Elijah, right? As we've studied, as we've journeyed with Elijah, we've seen that he kind of has a flair for the dramatic, right? He kind of likes a little bit of spectacle. It doesn't get much more dramatic than being brought up to heaven in a whirlwind, does it? We also get mention of Elisha here. Now, if you'll remember, we were introduced to Elisha back in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 19. And that's when, that chapter is when Elijah is hiding in the cleft of the rock, right? And he's making the complaint to God. Does anybody remember what his complaint to God was when he was hiding in the rock, in the cleft of the rock? Yes, sir. That he was the only one, right? He was saying, I'm the only one left. And we know that wasn't really true, but I think it speaks to Elijah's sense of loneliness, right? It speaks to Elijah's sense of feeling like he's all alone on this walk. And so God provides him with a student of sorts, Elisha. And we're introduced to Elisha just a few verses later. After we're introduced to Elisha, he doesn't really show up again. You know, he's not really mentioned until this chapter. But I think it's safe to assume that Elisha has been traveling with Elijah, that he's been learning from him, that he's been providing companionship. But this is the first time that he's directly mentioned since he was called by Elijah. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 2. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Did you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," Elisha replied, "but do not speak of it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, Elisha, the Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know," he replied, "but do not speak of it." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And Elisha replied, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them walked on. Elijah sure seems bound and determined to get rid of Elisha, doesn't he? Well, why? Why do you think that is? Why is Elijah asking Elisha to stay behind? This is his protege, his number one guy. Why is he saying, "Elisha, you stay back, I'm going to go by myself"? Why is he doing that? Yes, sir.
Maybe just because goodbyes are hard.
Because of what now?
Maybe just because goodbyes are hard.
Goodbyes are hard, yeah. Maybe he doesn't want Elisha to see what's going to happen, maybe. Anybody else?
He probably doesn't realize that Elisha knows what's going to happen.
Yeah. It does seem like this is kind of common knowledge, right? That something is going to happen today, because all the prophets that they meet are like, hey, Elisha, you know Elijah's going up, right? And Elisha's like, yeah, but let's not talk about it. So it seems like it's kind of common knowledge that something special is about to happen to Elijah. But maybe they don't know exactly what it is. What else? Why is Elijah trying to leave Elisha behind?
Is he trying to test him?
That's one possibility.
Well, one main thing I think is because of the way he's going up. However, that, I can't say for sure because it doesn't say there, but if Elijah was with him, he's taken up, Elisha may be taken up too. And he talks about a whirlwind. Well, what's a whirlwind?
Right.
A tornado? So if that kind of air mass is going to just take him up, it might take Elisha also. So he has to stay behind.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Then the Lord will wait.
It does kind of seem like maybe he's testing him a little bit, don't you think? Lynn?
When something happens 3 times in Scripture, it's significant. It means something. There's a symbolic thing happening.
Yeah.
And I think here we have the 3, hey, stay behind, and the 3, nope, I'm with you to the end.
Yeah.
I think that's very symbolic.
You know, when I was reading it, what kind of jumped into my head as maybe another example of this was Peter's denial of Christ, right? We have the same aspect of Peter being asked 3 times to affirm his loyalty to Christ. Peter fails that test, right? But Elisha here, when he's asked to affirm his loyalty to Elijah, he continuously affirms it those 3 times.
Jesus was tempted 3 times.
Mhm.
Well, I say
Yeah. The other possibility that popped into my head was maybe Elijah wanted some privacy. Maybe he was worried that if people saw this miracle, they may get the wrong message and start worshiping him, right? Elijah has been preaching against idol worship his whole life. The last thing he would want is for people to see a miraculous event that involved him and to start viewing him as an idol, right? And I think of what happened to Paul when he was on that island and all the snake bites and everything, and they healed him, and then they started worshiping Paul, and he was like, hold up, don't worship me. That's kind of what I'm thinking Elijah might be worried about here. But the text doesn't really say why Elijah's trying to leave Elisha. But we see the dedication that Elisha has towards his master, right? Elisha says, no, I'm staying with you until you're no longer with us. All right, any other thoughts on that? Or any other theories on why Elijah wanted to leave Elisha?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Just real quick, it may be just a sum of all fears. It may be a little blend of all the things that have been mentioned here today, too.
Yeah. It could be some of all of the above, right? Did I hear somebody else? Yes, ma'am.
And I think those are all very valid points. Over the years when I've read it, I've always just thought he was ready to go, and he felt like, you keep hanging on, God's not going to take me yet.
Yeah, maybe so.
I'm ready.
Yeah. Elijah's earned it, hasn't he? He may be ready to go.
If we think about the passing of the mantle, though, from one man to another, this does seem very much like a test of his loyalty, of his dedication. Because he's going to step into the shoes that Elijah's been filling. First of all, those are really big shoes. And second of all, is he committed to? Is he dedicated to? And the 3 times being turned away, the 3 times saying, nope, I'm going with you wherever you go. I think it proves his loyalty. You mentioned Peter's denial, that Jesus later reaffirms Peter by having him 3 times say, no, I love you, Lord, I love you, Lord, I love you. Right? Feed my sheep. And so there's a 3 times that Peter gets a second chance to reaffirm his commitment to Christ.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear in here that I don't know that Elijah wants him to go. I think it really is a test of his commitment.
Moses and Joshua
Mhm.
passing on leadership, in other words, to carry on.
Yeah, and we're going to see that some more parallels with Moses here in a minute. But this chapter, or this section, is definitely focused on the passing of the mantle from Elijah to Elisha.
Good, when you remember Ruth and Naomi,
I do remember them.
and what loyalty Ruth had to Naomi,
Mhm.
it reflects that too. I mean, I don't care where you go, I'm going with you. That speaks highly of one's loyalty.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I'll briefly mention before we continue reading, you'll notice there's a lot of other prophets popping up, right? We get 2 or 3 companies of about 50 prophets that show up. And, you know, we've seen as we've read through 1 Kings that Elijah, sometimes he's not really in the story, sometimes it's other prophets that are stepping up. You know, Jewish tradition is that Elijah had more students, if you will, than just Elisha. He kind of had a school of prophets, if you will. And so these may have been involved with Elijah before. Maybe they studied under him. Maybe they were inspired by him. But we see there's a lot more prophets of the Lord popping up in Israel during this time. All right, let's continue reading verses 7 through 10. "50 men of the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the 2 of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, 'Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?' 'Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit,' Elisha replied. 'You have asked a difficult thing,' Elijah said. 'Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours, otherwise not.' So Elijah has accepted that Elisha is not turning back, right? He's satisfied with his loyalty, or he's just given up, shaking Elisha. He's like, all right, Elisha's coming with me. But they've reached a barrier, right? They're at the shore of the Jordan River. So what does Elijah do here? What does Elijah do at the banks of the Jordan River?
Parts of the water.
He parts the waters. And who's that remind you of? Moses, right? Again, we see the parallels between Moses and Elijah. One, the father of the law maybe, and one, the head prophet, or the one who represents the prophets.
And he also had the parting of the water when they crossed over.
It's the second time the Jordan's been parted.
And of course, we see Moses and Elijah together again, right, on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus in the New Testament. So after they've crossed, now they have some privacy, it's just the 2 of them, teacher and student. What does Elijah ask Elisha? What's he asking?
What can I help you with before I go?
What can I do for you? It's everybody knows that Elijah's time has come. Elijah's saying, what's the one thing that you want from me? What can I do for you before I leave to help you? It shows the dedication that Elijah has towards Elisha, right? And the care, the relationships that's developed between them. What does Elisha ask for? A double portion, right? Yes.
Is he, maybe I'm reading too much into that, but if you were to receive a double portion of something, that is essentially being the firstborn son for the person, right? So is he asking here, like, let me essentially be your firstborn son?
I think he is. Yeah. I think he's saying, if you remember in Jewish law, the firstborn son got a double portion of the inheritance. And so I think Elisha here, it may be an answer with multiple layers to it. He may be asking literally, I want to have twice the spirit you do. I want to have even more of the God than you did in you. I think he's also making it crystal clear that I want to be your successor. I want to be considered your firstborn son. I want to be the one who carries on your work. And how does Elijah respond to that?
If you see when I leave, you will. If you don't, you went to sleep or whatever, you won't get it.
Yeah. He says it's a difficult thing you ask, right? I wonder if Elijah, as he's looking at Elisha, his adopted firstborn son, if he's looking at him and remembering all of the trials, all of the tribulations, all of the things that he went through in his life. You remember at one point Elijah wanted to die. He was so persecuted, so down in the dumps. I wonder if he's looking at his son and saying, I don't know if you really understand what you're asking for here, but if you see me go, then you will receive it. I would love to know more of what Elijah was thinking when he heard Elisha ask that. All right, any other thoughts on that section? All right, let's see what happens next. Verses 11 through 17. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them apart. He picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He asked. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. The company of the prophets from Jericho, who were watching, said, the spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha. And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. Look, they said, we your servants have 50 able men. Let them go and look for your master. Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has picked him up and put him down on some mountain or in some valley. No, Elisha said, do not send them. But they persisted until he was too ashamed to refuse. So he said, send them. And they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days but did not find him. When they returned to Elisha, who was staying in Jericho, he said to them, didn't I tell you not to go? So as Elijah and Elisha are walking and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire, horses of fire appear and separate the two of them. And Elijah is taken up to heaven. Wouldn't you like to know what they were talking about in these last few minutes? Right? Someone's last words are always powerful. But they're even more powerful when that person knows they're going to be their last words, right? And they use the last few breaths that they have to pass on whatever wisdom, whatever knowledge is most important to them that they've learned. And that's what Elijah and Elisha are doing right now. Elijah knows this is the last few breaths I'm going to take. So I would love to know what he told Elisha, what they were talking about as they were walking.
Well, it's the same as in the Transfiguration. We kind of would like to know what Jesus and Elijah and Moses were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Elijah is being taken up to heaven by the whirlwind, his cloak falls to the ground and Elisha picks it up. If you remember back in 1 Kings 19 when Elijah first called Elisha, he did that by putting his cloak on Elisha's shoulders, right? He put his cloak on Elisha's shoulders, and that was the sign that he was taking Elisha as his student. Well, now the mantle of being a prophet has fully fallen on Elisha. He is literally taking on the mantle that Elijah wore. He's continuing Elijah's ministry. And the text makes that clear when Elisha reaches the Jordan River, right? What happens when Elisha reaches that river?
Takes the mantle and strikes the water and it's settled.
Yeah. Elijah's last miracle is Elisha's first miracle. That's kind of neat, isn't it? And what does Elisha say when he takes the cloak and hits the water? What does he say? He says, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Israel?" What's Elisha asking? Elisha's asking, all right, it's time to see if I am the prophet. Is God with me or is he not? And that's how he finds out. And by departing of the waters, we see that Elijah's spirit has passed on to Elisha. And he recognizes that. Who else recognizes it? Right. The other prophets are standing there. They see it. They recognize it. There's no like succession controversy over who's going to be the next head prophet. They all recognize that it's Elisha, and they accept that.
To a point. Then,
To a point, yeah.
then they want to go looking for Elijah.
They do test him a little bit, right? Because they ask if he wants to go looking for Elijah. Elisha says no. What do you think the prophets are thinking, the ones that want to look for Elijah? They're thinking that maybe,
They're skeptical.
yeah, maybe this tornado would just move Elijah somewhere else. Maybe God was just moving him somewhere so they could talk. Well, why don't we go look for him? Elisha was the one who saw it and was there. Elisha knows what's actually happening. He says, no, it's not that, but he sends them out to look anyway. But they don't find him. So now we've seen Elijah taken up to heaven, the mantle passed on to Elisha. Do you remember? There it is. You remember Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and he gets that quite literally. He performs twice as many recorded miracles as Elijah did, and his ministry also lasts for much longer than Elijah's did. Elijah's was somewhere between 15 to 20 years. Elisha was 50 plus years. So we see here that Elisha, sorry, I'm sure I've mixed those up, but Elisha gets the double portion in the sense that he's the firstborn son, and also literally he gets maybe a double portion of ministry, a double portion of miracles. All right, any last thoughts on Elijah and Elisha? Yes, sir.
This little bit here, though, in 15 and 16, I think are a little tricky, at least for me. Like we're missing something in the translation from Hebrew to English or something where, because they see Elisha slap the river and they're like, oh, Elijah's spirit, but then immediately they're like, hey, let's go find him.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it seems contradictory, right? Like, it'd make more sense if they're like, wait, was that Elijah's spirit? We don't know.
Yeah.
What is this new spirit? Where's Elijah? So I don't know what we're necessarily missing, or I should say what I'm missing here, but, it's just the wording of it is weird
Yeah.
to me.
I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, but it is a little strange that they seem to acknowledge Elijah is gone, but then they want to look for him.
Like they recognize his spirit at work, because he even says, when he's slapping it, he's like, "Where's the Lord, the God of Elijah?" So he's like confirming, we're serving the same God here, doing the same miracle. They recognize it, and then, however, I don't know how much time is in between that exclamation and then verse 16, could be weeks or months or something, but then they're like, yeah, let's go find him.
Yeah.
But if you saw it, why? It's like,
Yeah, it's a little curious.
yeah.
You guys, it's a pretty atypical way to leave the earth, so.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had some questions, I'm sure. Yes, ma'am.
Well, they had already acknowledged that this was his last day.
Mhm.
I almost think it was a point, they were wanting to get his body that they wanted, and the same like with Moses, it wasn't available, because who knows what, that they might, the importance they would put on that.
Yeah.
So I kind of figured that they were asking, okay, we're gonna go get him. They acknowledged that it had been passed on, but they wanted to go get the body.
That is another interesting little parallel between Moses and Elijah, right? They're both kind of taken in a different way. Moses dies, but then he's buried by God, right? Elijah is taken up by God in a special manner. So you know, we've been noting these parallels between Moses and Elijah the whole way. It's interesting how they keep interacting. Dennis?
This is a little bit off subject from where you've been, but one thing, I've done one or two things in my lifetime, and I've had people say, you shouldn't mourn, you need to get on with your life. Don't be sad about it. God knows when we lose a loved one that we're gonna mourn. Elisha mourned the loss of Elijah. And we today, when we lose loved ones, let's comfort one another, let's strengthen one another. Let's not try to tell people, you need to get this behind you. I mean, I've had people literally do that. It just upsets me.
Yeah. And we see it when Elisha sees Elijah taken away, what does he do? He rips his clothes, right? So he's obviously distressed, distraught over losing his father figure. All right, any last thoughts, Jack?
I see a big white elephant standing in the room here.
Oh, yeah?
And what that is to me, apparently he didn't die. Apparently he went
Well,
to
yeah.
heaven without tasting death.
There's no telling what happened to him when he was in the whirlwind. Maybe he died, maybe he
Maybe he
didn't.
got killed, huh?
Yeah. Like I said, there's no way of telling.
Well, in Hebrews, it, let me read this right. Make sure I got it right. In Hebrews 11, he's talking about in 39 and 40, and he talks about all the great people of the Bible.
Right.
And in 39, and all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. But he sure looks like he's been separated to me.
Yeah. Like I said, it's definitely a unique way to go. We don't know exactly what happened. But I think the important thing is we see how highly God thought of Elijah, right? That Elijah was taken up in that manner, different than anybody else has ever been taken up.
Didn't he take?
You're right. He took one other person up similar.
Yeah, Enoch, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a very couple of people who were taken up that way. All right, the last few minutes here, I want to cover something. You know, we've seen through our study, we've seen now the death of King Ahab. We've seen Elijah taken up into heaven. But there's one main character we've been talking about that has a loose end dangling, right? And who's that? Jezebel. So if you'll turn with me, yeah. If you'll turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 9, starting in verse 30. And that's where we're told about Jezebel's death. And so Jezebel outlives her husband and Elijah. You know, she's not mentioned in the story, but she's hanging around. All right, so 2 Kings 9, verse 30. Then Jehu went to Jezreel, and we'll talk about all these people after we finish, all right? Jehu went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard about it, she painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out of the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she asked, "Have you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master?" He looked up at the window and called out, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him. "Throw her down," Jehu said. So they threw her down, and some of her blood splattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. Jehu went in and ate and drank. "Take care of that cursed woman," he said, "and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." But when they went out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. They went back and told Jehu, who said, "This is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's body will be like refuse on the ground in the plot at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, 'This is Jezebel.'" So we're introduced to a new character here, obviously because we skipped, 6 chapters. But if you'll remember back to the prophecy that God gave Elijah on Mount Sinai in 1 Kings 19, verse 15, he said that he would use Jehu to put to death those who have worshipped idols. And so we see the fulfillment of that here, right? We also see the fulfillment of the prophecy that God passed, or the judgment that God passed on Jezebel after the murder of Naboth, right, for his vineyard. That was in 1 Kings 21:23, where he said, she will die in Jezreel and dogs will lick up her blood. Queen Jezebel, who was so commanding and so powerful, so fearful, that even Elijah fled from her. At the end, we see her betrayed by her servants, to the ground, eaten by dogs. I can't even find her whole body at the end. So we see such a contrast between the deaths of Ahab and Jezebel and the deaths of Elijah, right? In the world, on the earth, Ahab and Jezebel were the most powerful people in Israel. They were king and queen. They ruled the country. But when it came time for them to die, they were humiliated. They were humbled by God. And so it's an interesting reversal. Elijah, the man with no ancestry, no family, the nobody, was elevated to heaven in a whirlwind, accompanied by a chariot of fire and horsemen. And the king and queen of Israel are humbled, humiliated in their deaths. And as far as Jezebel is concerned, they don't even find her body. So, it's a nice, well, I don't know if it's nice, but it's a lesson for us there, I think.
There is an interesting parallel there. Obviously, these stories are wildly different, but there's one thing that's the same, and that is there is no body, right? And with the case of Jezebel, right, there's an explicit reason, right? They don't want her body to be buried in a way that she's venerated and becomes an idol for those people. And I think in the same way, right, they can't find Elijah's body, they can't find him, and that seems distressing to some of them, right? But there's a very good reason that we don't have his body either, right? The people of Israel have this propensity to idolatry, and whether they're turning evil people into idols or amazing people who follow God into idols, that's still a problem either way. And I think that parallel between these stories, right, reflects Israel's temptation to worship idols and also God's intervention saying, no, don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something Elijah struggled against it, and Elisha is going to continue to struggle against it. Maybe we'll do a class on Elisha in the near future, continue this story. All right, any last thoughts before we close this morning?
Kind of what she said about people idolizing or worshiping Elijah because he was taken away. Well, that's kind of what we do. We worship the guy that went up that road.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big parallel there between Christ's ascension and Elijah's ascension. And that kind of gets back to what I'm talking about. There had, in my way of thinking, absolutely not, I'm not saying I'm to blame, but there has to be an enormous connection between the way Christ went to heaven and Elijah went to heaven. I just don't know what it is yet, but it just seems like they're
similar, you're
there's
right.
gotta be a big connection.
All right, so next week, Don Allen's gonna wrap up this series for us. And then the following week, we'll start new classes. All right, so in this room, Chris Miller and Bobby Bayer are going to be going over the minor prophets. I believe Bobby's starting with Obadiah, right? Yeah, so Obadiah will be week 1. And then over in the annex, Ben Green and Dale Manor are going to be teaching a class that's going to be utilizing the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. I'm sure they've got a great class worked up over there. I haven't talked to them about it, but I'm sure it'll be great. All right, thank you all for your attention this morning. This will be the last time you hear from me from this class, so thank you for all of your comments, questions.